In a quieter version of history, there was never a moment when the world became connected all at once. No signals crossed oceans in an instant. No messages traveled faster than thought. Information moved slowly, carried by paper, memory, and time. Cities grew without glowing screens. Evenings remained uninterrupted, and human attention followed a gentler rhythm. This is a calm reflection on how the world might have unfolded if the internet had never been created. There is no beginning you need to focus on, and no ending you need to reach. Time simply moves forward, quietly. Over time, the absence of distant signals shaped habits so subtly that few ever thought to name it, and daily life unfolded with a pace that seemed neither slow nor fast, but simply consistent. As mornings opened with the quiet presence of paper resting on tables, ink drying patiently, shelves holding the accumulated weight of decisions made by hands rather than by circuits speaking to other circuits, and people moving through streets with an awareness bounded by what could be seen, heard, or remembered rather than by what might be arriving invisibly from elsewhere, so that knowledge remained something encountered rather than received, something found rather than summoned, and this condition persisting quietly became the background rhythm against which decades passed. In laboratories where early computers had once been assembled with a sense of cautious optimism, the machines continued to hum in isolation, each one a contained universe of calculation, their screens glowing softly with numbers and text that never traveled beyond the room unless someone chose to print them, carry them, or recite them, and engineers adjusted their expectations gradually, designing systems not for connection but for reliability, storage, and local precision, so that the culture of computing matured as a craft focused on endurance and clarity rather than speed or reach, and manuals thickened while cables remained short. Year after year, libraries retained their central position, not as monuments but as working spaces where footsteps softened instinctively, where librarians developed long memories of readers' interests, recalling without effort who favored astronomy, who preferred local history, who returned again and again to the same table by the window, and the act of searching involved movement through aisles, the slow tracing of fingers along spines, the patient unfolding of index cards, each motion contributing to a sense that understanding was something grown through proximity and time, not something delivered. In the background of everyday life, letters continued to cross borders tucked inside envelopes, their journeys measured in days or weeks, and this delay shaped expression itself, encouraging sentences that lingered, explanations that accounted for absence, and reflections that assumed time for reconsideration. So correspondence developed a tone of continuity rather than interruption, with writers aware that the moment of reading would already belong to a slightly different world, and this awareness softened certainty without erasing it. Cities expanded without digital coordination, guided instead by physical maps, municipal records, and the accumulated intuition of planners who walked the streets they altered, and without distant oversight, projects proceeded at human speed, allowing neighborhoods to adapt incrementally, so the commercial districts grew dense but not dominant, and no single building seemed to promise transformation, only accommodation, and the skyline shifted quietly, one modest addition at a time. As the late 20th century progressed, international awareness depended on newspapers that arrived folded and creased, their foreign sections offering glimpses rather than streams, and readers absorbed these fragments alongside the smell of ink and the familiarity of layout, so global events felt less immediate and more contemplative, encouraging reflection rather than reaction. And editors, knowing their words would be reread rather than refreshed, chose them carefully, favoring steadiness over novelty. Education unfolded within classrooms where chalk dust settled slowly and diagrams remained visible for days, allowing concepts to mature through repetition. And students learned not only facts but the patience of accumulation, as research meant hours spent copying passages by hand or waiting for interlibrary loans. And this effort filtered curiosity, guiding it towards subjects that sustained attention rather than those that merely attracted it briefly. Quietly, economies developed along regional lines, with supply chains remaining tangible and visible so that production retained a sense of place, and consumers recognized the origins of what they used, not through labels alone but through familiarity, and markets adjusted through seasonal rhythms, fairs, and negotiated relationships, while financial records lived in ledgers balanced by people who understood their weight. The absence of instant communication preserved long silences between events, and within these spaces individuals cultivated internal narratives, thinking through problems without expecting immediate feedback. And this habit, reinforced across generations, strengthened concentration, allowing attention to rest on a single task for extended periods, whether repairing a machine, tending a garden, or reading through a complex argument. And these moments accumulated quietly, shaping a collective temperament that valued continuity. When personal computers became common fixtures in homes, they were treated as tools rather than portals, used for writing, calculation, and local storage, their presence accepted without ceremony. And families arranged them near desks rather than couches, reinforcing their role as instruments of work and study. And software evolved slowly, distributed on physical media, updated infrequently, so that users learned their functions deeply instead of constantly adapting to change. Over decades, this stability allowed skills to root themselves firmly, and professions developed distinct identities unblurred by remote competition, as craftsmen, analysts, and teachers built reputations within reachable circles, and recognition traveled through recommendation rather than visibility, so success felt personal and bounded, reducing the pressure to expand endlessly. As the calendar turned toward the early 21st century, the world retained a sense of density without acceleration, with travel remaining purposeful rather than habitual, and meetings planned with care, so that gatherings held weight and conversations unfolded without distraction, voices uninterrupted by unseen signals, and silence accepted as part of exchange rather than something to be filled. In towns and cities alike, bulletin boards continued to gather notices layered over time, edges curling, colors fading, each message lingering until replaced, and this physical accumulation mirrored the way information itself settled, overlapping rather than replacing, and residents learned to read between postings, understanding relevance through context rather than prominence. The year that elsewhere might have been marked by rapid shifts passed here with little distinction, and technological change continued to arrive in measured increments, refining existing tools rather than redefining them, so that progress felt like smoothing rather than leap. And this texture influenced expectations, encouraging planning that extended forward without urgency. Within households, evenings often unfolded with shared reading, writing, or quiet listening, as recorded music played without interruption, entire albums heard as cohesive works, and radio programs followed schedules that invited anticipation rather than demand, and this predictability lent comfort without monotony, allowing routines to anchor days gently. Knowledge moved through apprenticeships and mentorships, as experienced individuals passed insights through demonstration and conversation, and this transmission preserved nuance, allowing errors to be corrected in context and wisdom to be conveyed with the pacing of lived experience, rather than compressed into abstractions. Gradually, the modern world, as it came to be called, settled into a form that felt both familiar and unremarkable, with machines serving quietly, infrastructure maintained steadily, and cultural exchange proceeding through travel, print, and memory, so that diversity persisted without flattening, and differences remained legible rather than homogenized. In offices, documents accumulated in folders arranged by hand, and retrieval depended on memory as much as indexing, reinforcing awareness of organizational structures, and decisions carried the weight of effort required to revise them, fostering deliberation. As years continued to pass, the relationship between people and time remained unmediated, marked by clocks and calendars but not compressed by continuous updates, so anticipation and recollection retained their full spans, and waiting became an accepted component of experience rather than an obstacle. Libraries expanded their archives carefully, balancing space with preservation, and readers learned to navigate absence as well as presence, recognizing that not everything was immediately accessible, and this limitation framed inquiry with humility. The world approaching 2026 felt neither advanced nor behind, but settled into its own coherence, with neighborhoods retaining identities shaped by history rather than branding, and cities humming at a low, steady volume, their nights dark enough for stars to remain visible above rooftops. People aged alongside their tools, watching devices remain useful across decades, and this continuity softened generational divides, as shared references persisted longer, and conversation bridged ages through common experience rather than nostalgia. Throughout all of this, time continued its quiet movement, not announcing itself, only accumulating through routines, memories, and the slow turning of pages, and the absence of invisible networks remained unnoticed by most, simply because life, unfolding at its chosen pace, offered enough texture to occupy attention. And so days continued to layer themselves gently, one after another, without reaching for completion, allowing the present to extend calmly forward, breathing evenly, as it always had. And as that even breathing of time carried onward, the small details of ordinary existence continued to gather meaning through repetition rather than emphasis, so that a morning tram moving along the same route year after year became a kind of shared memory, its worn handrails polished by countless palms, its schedule known not by consultation but by habit, and conductors recognized faces without naming them, exchanging nods that required no explanation, while outside the windows storefronts changed slowly, one sign replaced after another, never all at once, preserving continuity even in alteration. In workshops and offices, the rhythm of labor followed daylight and fatigue more than abstract targets, and without constant distant comparison, productivity found its measure in completion rather than acceleration, so craftspeople adjusted their pace to materials, allowing wood to rest, ink to settle, calculations to be checked twice before acceptance, and this patience, practiced daily, embedded itself into the way problems were approached, favoring resolution through accumulation instead of immediacy. Over time, universities evolved into dense ecosystems of presence, where scholars traveled deliberately to consult one another, planning visits months in advance. And these encounters carried weight precisely because of their rarity. Conversations stretching over long meals, ideas unfolding gradually, notes exchanged by hand, and disagreements softened by the recognition that continued dialogue required shared space and time rather than endless exchange. In homes, shelves bowed slightly under the mass of encyclopedias, dictionaries, and personal notebooks, each volume representing a decision to keep rather than discard. And children grew accustomed to learning through physical reference, developing spatial memories of information, recalling not only what they read but where it lived, and this anchoring of knowledge to place deepened recall in quiet ways. News traveled through layered channels, first as rumor, then as print, then as confirmation, and this staggered movement allowed emotion to dissipate before reaction, so events were absorbed with steadiness, and conversation reflected consideration rather than immediacy, with people speaking from a position of partial understanding that they expected to refine over time. As technology advanced incrementally, machines became sturdier rather than faster, designed to endure rather than impress, and manufacturers prioritized repairability, knowing replacement involved effort. And this expectation cultivated a culture of maintenance, where objects carried histories of use and care, and familiarity with tools extended beyond operation into understanding. Quietly, art developed along similarly deliberate lines, with exhibitions remaining local affairs, attended by those who had followed an artist's progression over years. And appreciation grew through sustained exposure, styles evolving gradually as influences arrived through travel, books, and personal exchange, rather than appearing simultaneously everywhere. Public spaces retained their function as centers of exchange, with cafes serving as informal offices, reading rooms, and meeting points, where conversations overlapped gently, and silence was not absence but a shared agreement to coexist without intrusion, and these spaces fostered a sense of collective presence that required no amplification. In the absence of constant notification, memory remained active, exercised daily through recall of appointments, addresses, and passages of text, and this practice strengthened internal continuity, allowing individuals to carry extended narratives within themselves, linking past experiences to present actions without external prompts. As seasons continued their predictable cycles, agriculture maintained its local character, guided by observation and record-keeping rather than distant data streams, and farmers relied on journals kept across generations, noting patterns of weather and yield, and these handwritten records formed a slow conversation between past and present, informing decisions without demanding certainty. Gradually, the texture of time itself seemed thicker, each year containing fewer distinct markers yet more depth, as days were not subdivided endlessly, and attention lingered where it landed, allowing moments to stretch without urgency. And this elasticity of experience reduced the sense of scarcity often associated with passing hours. In civic life, decisions unfolded through meetings attended in person, with attendance reflecting commitment rather than convenience, and discussion progressed methodically, pauses accepted, documents reviewed collectively, and outcomes reached through consensus built over repeated encounters, reinforcing trust through familiarity. The world approaching the mid-2020s carried the accumulated weight of this slower unfolding, not as burden but as density, with traditions persisting not because they resisted change, but because change itself arrived through continuity, and innovation took the form of refinement rather than replacement. Transportation systems reflected similar principles, favoring reliability over speed, and journeys were planned with margins, acknowledging uncertainty without frustration, and travelers used transit time for reflection, reading, or quiet observation, allowing movement itself to become part of daily rhythm rather than an interruption. Across generations, stories were told and retold without compression, evenings spent recounting experiences that had shaped families and communities. And these narratives evolved subtly with each telling, preserving essence while adapting to context. And this oral continuity complemented written record, ensuring that meaning remained alive rather than fixed. In workplaces, mentorship unfolded through proximity, newer members absorbing not only techniques but unspoken norms. And learning occurred through observation as much as instruction, embedding professional culture within daily interaction, rather than formal documentation alone. As years continued to pass, the notion of distance retained its physical significance, and correspondence maintained its ceremonial aspect. Envelopes opened carefully, letters reread, stored, or shared selectively, and this materiality preserved intimacy without saturation. Even as scientific understanding expanded, dissemination remained deliberate, with journals printed and distributed to institutions, peer review proceeding at human pace, and theories matured through sustained debate, allowing uncertainty to coexist with progress without pressure for immediate resolution. The accumulated effect of these patterns was not stagnation but steadiness, a world moving forward with its attention intact, where individuals navigated complexity through patience and presence, and the absence of invisible networks remained an unremarked constant, shaping life not by what was missing, but by what endured. As days continued to layer themselves gently, each one settling into the next, extending forward without conclusion, maintaining a calm continuity that allowed time to breathe evenly as it went on. And within that even cadence, the ordinary rituals of record-keeping continued to occupy a quiet but persistent role, as calendars hung on walls bearing annotations made in pencil, adjusted and erased as plans shifted gently, and diaries accumulated observations that were never intended for circulation, capturing weather, moods, small encounters, and fragments of thought, so that personal history formed as a layered sediment rather than a curated archive. And rereading these pages years later offered not revelation, but a soft recognition of continuity. In municipal offices, clerks maintained files with practiced motions, their familiarity with the weight and texture of documents guiding retrieval more reliably than any abstract system. And this embodied knowledge passed unnoticed between colleagues, forming an institutional memory that existed nowhere in full but everywhere in practice, so that even as individuals retired or moved on, the rhythm of work persisted with minimal disruption. Gradually, patterns of travel settled into established corridors, trains and buses following routes that had proven useful through repetition, and stations became landmarks of routine rather than gateways to novelty, their benches bearing the imprint of waiting, and travelers learned to inhabit these intervals comfortably, reading newspapers from beginning to end, or simply observing the measured flow of arrivals and departures without impatience. In schools, lessons unfolded with an emphasis on sequence, subjects revisited year after year from different angles, allowing understanding to deepen through familiarity, and students developed a sense of progression that mirrored the larger world around them, where change arrived through accumulation rather than interruption, reinforcing confidence in steady effort. Markets retained their physical presence as spaces of exchange and encounter, with vendors arranging goods carefully, adjusting displays in response to weather and season, and customers recognizing patterns of availability that shaped meals and habits, so consumption aligned naturally with cycles rather than abstraction, and satisfaction arose from alignment rather than abundance. Over time, craftsmanship remained visible in everyday objects, joints and seams revealing the hands that formed them, and this visibility fostered appreciation without sentimentality, as wear was accepted as evidence of use rather than decline, and repair became a continuation of creation rather than its failure. As scientific instruments grew more precise, their outputs still required interpretation grounded in context, and researchers spent long hours comparing measurements, calibrating against known standards, and discussing discrepancies face to face, allowing consensus to emerge through shared experience rather than numerical convergence alone. Cultural memory persisted through festivals and commemorations that emphasized recurrence over novelty, events returning annually with small variations, and participants recognized that meaning resided in repetition itself, the familiarity allowing attention to settle on nuance rather than spectacle. In private moments, individuals continued to reflect without external reference, thoughts unfolding internally over extended periods, revisited and revised through quiet consideration, and this internal dialogue remained uninterrupted by constant input, allowing a sense of coherence to develop gradually. As the years advanced toward the middle of the decade, technological tools integrated further into daily routines without displacing existing practices, enhancing efficiency in bounded ways while leaving the broader structure of life unchanged. And this selective adoption reinforced a balance between assistance and autonomy. Neighborhoods maintained social density through shared spaces and repeated encounters, trust developing incrementally as faces became familiar, and conflict, when it arose, resolved through conversation grounded in ongoing relationship rather than anonymity, reinforcing accountability through presence. The circulation of ideas continued to depend on deliberate dissemination. Lectures announced weeks in advance, attendance reflecting interest cultivated over time, and discussion extending beyond the event into subsequent meetings and correspondence, allowing thought to mature through sustained engagement. As seasons continued their reliable passage, landscapes changed slowly under human stewardship. Urban and rural boundaries negotiated through planning that favored integration rather than expansion, and green spaces persisted as buffers of continuity within built environments. Through all of this, the absence of instantaneous global linkage remained unremarkable, life proceeding without awareness of what might have been otherwise, and the present extended itself calmly forward, composed of routines, relationships, and reflections that accumulated without striving toward resolution, allowing time to continue its quiet movement, unbroken and unhurried, breathing steadily as days layered themselves gently into an ongoing now. And within that ongoing now, the practice of learning by observation retained its quiet authority, as apprentices watched experienced hands repeat motions refined over decades, absorbing timing and pressure without explicit instruction. And this tacit knowledge traveled slowly but reliably, embedding itself in muscle memory and habit, so that competence emerged not as a milestone but as a gradual easing into familiarity. In publishing houses, editors worked through manuscripts line by line, pencils marking margins with restrained notes, and authors accepted the interval between submission and response as part of the process, using the waiting to reconsider arguments or simply to let ideas rest, and when revisions arrived, they were integrated thoughtfully, reflecting dialogue rather than reaction. Hospitals and clinics functioned with an emphasis on continuity of care, records maintained in physical files that accumulated chronologically, allowing practitioners to perceive patterns across years, and patients experienced treatment as an ongoing relationship rather than a sequence of isolated encounters, reinforcing trust through familiarity and time. Urban mornings began with predictable sounds, doors opening, footsteps echoing briefly, vehicles starting and moving off without haste, and these auditory markers framed the day gently, signaling activity without demanding attention, while evenings settled into quieter tones, radios lowered, lights dimmed gradually, routines unfolding without abrupt transition. As research libraries expanded their collections, acquisition decisions reflected long-term relevance rather than immediate demand, curators selecting works expected to endure, and this foresight shaped scholarship by privileging depth over immediacy, encouraging sustained inquiry into subjects that rewarded patience. In family homes, photographs accumulated in albums rather than streams, each image selected deliberately, labeled occasionally, and revisited during gatherings, allowing memory to be shared physically, pages turned slowly, stories resurfacing naturally without prompting, reinforcing continuity through tangible artifacts. Commerce maintained its measured pace, contracts negotiated in person, signatures applied with awareness of commitment, and disputes resolved through reference to shared understanding rather than rapid escalation, reinforcing the idea that economic relationships were extensions of social ones, grounded in presence. Transportation hubs remained functional rather than symbolic, their architecture prioritizing flow and clarity, signage static and legible, and travelers learned routes through repetition, internalizing geography in ways that reduced reliance on instruction, fostering confidence through experience. As decades layered themselves one upon another, generational transitions occurred without sharp delineation, younger members assuming roles gradually, mentored by predecessors, and this continuity preserved institutional memory while allowing subtle adaptation, change arriving through adjustment rather than replacement. In academic settings, debates unfolded across semesters and years, positions refined incrementally, citations traced through physical texts, and disagreement persisted without urgency, understood as part of a longer conversation rather than a contest to be resolved. allowing intellectual culture to remain spacious. Public broadcasting followed schedules that shaped daily rhythms, programs anticipated rather than accessed on demand, and listeners adjusted their routines accordingly, integrating these intervals into life rather than bending life around them, reinforcing a sense of shared time. As urban populations grew modestly, housing adapted through renovation and infill rather than sprawl, neighborhoods retaining scale and coherence, and residents developed attachment to place through long-term presence, knowing histories embedded in buildings and streets. In workplaces, evaluation relied on observation over time, performance assessed through consistency and reliability rather than bursts of output, and recognition arrived quietly, often through increased responsibility rather than public acknowledgement, aligning ambition with steadiness. Scientific conferences required travel and preparation, attendance signaling commitment, and discussions extended beyond formal sessions into walks and meals, ideas exchanged in relaxed continuity, allowing nuance to surface through unhurried conversation. Through all these patterns, the flow of time remained perceptible, marked by aging trees, worn steps, and familiar routines, and the absence of constant external input allowed awareness to remain anchored in immediate surroundings, fostering a calm attentiveness that permeated daily life. As the calendar advanced, the modern world continued to feel neither compressed nor expanded, simply inhabited, and days unfolded with a predictability that did not preclude variation, allowing small differences to be noticed and appreciated, and so the present extended itself onward, quietly, without boundary, each moment settling into the next, maintaining its gentle continuity as time continued to breathe. And as that gentle continuity carried forward, the habits of documentation remained steady, with institutions preserving archives in climate-controlled rooms, where the air smelled faintly of paper and binding glue, and archivists moved slowly among shelves, attentive to order rather than speed, so that the past stayed accessible without asserting itself, present as reference rather than influence. In neighborhoods, the passing of years revealed itself through subtle shifts, a familiar shopkeeper replaced by a younger relative, a bench repainted, a tree trimmed back and then allowed to grow again, and residents noticed these changes not as events, but as textures added to an already known landscape, reinforcing a sense that place itself was a participant in daily life. Workdays continued to begin and end with physical cues, clocks chiming softly, light changing angle, bodies tiring naturally, and this attunement to environment reduced abstraction, aligning effort with capacity and leaving evenings open for rest that felt earned rather than enforced. Libraries extended their role beyond storage into quiet centers of presence, offering reading rooms where individuals sat together without interaction, sharing a collective silence that carried its own form of connection. And over time, these spaces became anchors within cities, valued less for novelty than for reliability. In rural areas, distances retained their meaning, and travel between towns involved planning and patience. So visits were fewer but longer, conversations deeper, and hospitality more deliberate, reinforcing bonds through sustained presence rather than frequent contact. The slow circulation of ideas encouraged reinterpretation, as concepts arrived filtered through translation, commentary, and local context, adapting naturally without pressure for uniformity, and this process preserved diversity of thought while maintaining coherence across regions. Educational materials evolved conservatively, textbooks revised periodically rather than continuously, allowing generations to share references, and teachers supplemented content with lived experience, contextualizing information within familiar frameworks, strengthening comprehension through continuity. In manufacturing centers, quality control relied on human inspection, eyes and hands detecting variations, and this attentiveness maintained standards through care rather than automation, embedding responsibility within the production process itself. Cultural exchange persisted through travel, exhibitions, and translated works, each arrival marked by anticipation built over time, and audiences engaged with new material patiently, allowing appreciation to develop gradually rather than through immediate judgment. As scientific understanding expanded into new domains, communication of findings emphasized clarity and restraint, avoiding speculation beyond evidence, and this discipline maintained trust, allowing knowledge to accumulate steadily without overstretch. Public records continued to be updated methodically, census data compiled through visits and forms, and this effort reinforced awareness of community composition, grounding policy in observed reality rather than abstract modeling. Within households, routines adjusted slowly as generations overlapped, traditions adapted without abrupt discontinuity, and children absorbed norms through observation, internalizing values not as directives but as patterns lived daily. Transportation timetables remained stable, revised infrequently, and commuters synchronized their lives around them, fostering predictability that reduced cognitive load, freeing attention for reflection during transit. Artistic practice remained rooted in material engagement, painters working with light and pigment over extended periods, musicians rehearsing acoustically, and audiences experiencing performances as singular events rather than reproducible content, heightening presence through impermanence. As the years continued to layer, the sense of historical progression softened, with fewer sharp markers dividing eras, and instead a gradual evolution unfolded, noticeable mainly in retrospect, allowing the present to feel continuous rather than transitional. In all these ways, life proceeded without haste, shaped by tangible processes and human pacing, and the absence of unseen networks remained simply part of the environment, neither noted nor missed, as days followed one another with measured calm, each moment easing into the next, sustaining the quiet rhythm of time as it continued onward, unbroken, unhurried, and gently persistent. And within that persistence, the role of memory continued to assert itself gently, not as an archive to be consulted on demand, but as a living process shaped by repetition and omission, so that people recalled not exact sequences but textures of experience, the way a room felt at a certain hour, the cadence of a colleague's speech, the familiar resistance of a drawer that had always required a careful pull, and these recollections informed behavior quietly, guiding choices without announcing their influence. In municipal parks, maintenance followed seasonal routines learned over years, gardeners observing soil and foliage with practiced attention, adjusting care incrementally, and visitors returned to the same paths repeatedly, noticing small variations in growth and light, developing a sense of continuity that did not rely on documentation. Only presence and benches became places of habitual pause rather than destinations. The circulation of professional knowledge continued through conferences and printed proceedings that arrived months after events, read slowly and discussed within local groups, allowing findings to be contextualized against existing practice. And this delay softened adoption, encouraging adaptation rather than replication, so methods evolved in alignment with local conditions. Retail spaces remained modest in scale, inventories curated with awareness of clientele, and relationships between sellers and buyers matured over time, fostering mutual understanding that reduced the need for constant persuasion, as trust functioned as an accumulated resource maintained through consistency. In households, appliances were selected for durability, manuals kept and consulted, repairs attempted before replacement, and this approach cultivated familiarity with objects, transforming use into stewardship, and the lifespan of things extended naturally through care rather than constraint. Educational institutions maintained archives of student work, not for comparison but for reference, allowing educators to observe shifts in expression over years, and this long view informed teaching subtly, recognizing patterns without categorizing them rigidly. As transportation infrastructure aged, renewal occurred through refurbishment rather than overhaul, preserving recognizable forms while improving function. And this continuity reinforced spatial memory, enabling navigation without constant adjustment. Civic ceremonies persisted with understated formality, attendance reflecting shared acknowledgement rather than spectacle, and these gatherings reinforced communal rhythm, marking time without dramatization, allowing significance to arise through recurrence. In research environments, experimentation proceeded methodically, hypotheses refined through incremental testing, and failure integrated as information rather than setback, contributing to a culture that valued thoroughness over immediacy, and progress unfolded as a series of careful steps. The exchange of personal news continued through letters and occasional calls, messages composed with awareness of distance and delay. And this consideration shaped tone, encouraging completeness and reflection, so communication carried a sense of occasion even when content was ordinary. Urban evenings settled into predictable patterns, lights appearing gradually, streets quieting without instruction, and residents adjusted intuitively, aligning activity with shared cues rather than external prompts. And this synchronization fostered a collective ease. In rural regions, craftsmanship persisted across generations, skills transmitted through demonstration and shared labor, and these practices anchored identity in doing rather than declaring, sustaining traditions through use rather than preservation alone. As years continued to pass, the distinction between work and rest remained perceptible, transitions marked by physical movement rather than mental shift, and this clarity supported balance without formal intervention, allowing fatigue and recovery to find their own alignment. Cultural institutions curated collections with an eye toward continuity, rotating exhibits slowly, allowing visitors to develop familiarity over repeated visits. And this repetition deepened engagement, transforming observation into relationship. Throughout all of this, the broader world remained present but distant, known through mediated fragments that invited contemplation rather than reaction, and individuals oriented themselves within this expanse through local reference points, grounding awareness in immediate surroundings. The passage of time continued to be sensed through accumulation rather than signal, through wear and renewal, memory and routine, and life advanced without urgency, each day extending the pattern gently, without closure or culmination, as the present carried itself forward calmly, maintaining its steady breath as it went on. And as that steady breath of the present carried on, the role of craftsmanship in everyday repair remained quietly visible, with seams restitched, hinges oiled, pages rebound, and these acts of maintenance blended seamlessly into daily routines, reinforcing the idea that continuity was something practiced rather than assumed, and that care itself was a form of participation in time. In administrative offices, typewriters and later word processors continued their service long after newer models existed elsewhere, keys worn smooth by use, operators developing a rhythm that aligned thought with motion, and documents emerged at a pace that encouraged rereading, revisions made deliberately, allowing language to settle before being released into circulation. Public memory took shape through plaques, modest monuments, and named streets, markers that blended into surroundings rather than commanding attention, and residents passed them daily without ceremony, absorbing their presence gradually, so history remained embedded rather than highlighted. Seasonal commerce followed established cycles, shop windows changing displays incrementally, reflecting weather and availability, and customers anticipated these shifts intuitively, aligning expectations with pattern rather than announcement, which reduced surprise but deepened familiarity. In academic libraries, marginal notes accumulated in personal copies rather than shared texts, scholars developing private dialogues with authors across years, and these annotations formed intellectual companions, revisited repeatedly, allowing understanding to mature through sustained engagement rather than rapid overview. The exchange of technical knowledge in trades relied on manuals supplemented by lived experience, diagrams studied alongside practice, and this combination ensured that understanding remained grounded, preventing abstraction from drifting too far from application. Urban planning continued to prioritize walkability and human scale, decisions informed by observation of movement patterns rather than predictive models, and adjustments implemented slowly, allowing residents to adapt organically, preserving coherence within change. Music remained a temporal art experienced in sequence, performances attended attentively, listeners present for entire programs, and this commitment shaped appreciation, allowing themes to resonate over time and silence between pieces to hold meaning without discomfort. In personal correspondence, handwriting retained its individuality, variations in pressure and spacing conveying mood subtly, and recipients recognized these nuances instinctively, adding depth to communication beyond words, reinforcing connection through physical trace. Healthcare advanced through cumulative knowledge, practitioners consulting printed journals and colleagues, integrating new findings cautiously, and this deliberation balanced innovation with reliability, sustaining trust through continuity. As years advanced, the relationship between generations remained layered, elders sharing perspective through storytelling rather than instruction, and younger members absorbing values implicitly, allowing continuity without rigidity, adaptation without rupture. Public transportation schedules remained stable, deviations rare and notable, and this reliability reduced anxiety, allowing planning to remain simple, freeing attention for observation, reading, or quiet reflection during transit. In scientific fields, long-term observation projects flourished, data collected over decades, researchers committed to patience, understanding that significance often emerged only through extended accumulation, and this temporal depth shaped interpretation. Markets adjusted prices gradually, changes communicated through posted notices rather than instant updates, and consumers adapted without urgency, incorporating variation into expectation, reducing volatility in both behavior and emotion. Throughout communities, volunteer organizations persisted, sustained by regular meetings and shared purpose, and participation deepened through familiarity, relationships strengthened by repeated collaboration rather than fleeting engagement. The texture of daily life continued to be defined by tangible interactions, voices heard directly, gestures observed, and this immediacy grounded experience, preventing abstraction from dominating perception. As the calendar moved forward without fanfare, the sense of living within history softened, the present extending itself naturally, and individuals oriented themselves not toward milestones, but toward routines that provided continuity. In all these ways, the world continued to unfold calmly, shaped by human pacing and physical connection, and time advanced not as a series of moments to be captured, but as a medium inhabited steadily, each day blending into the next without demand for conclusion, maintaining its gentle rhythm and continuing onward, quietly, as it always had. And within that ongoing steadiness, the role of patience continued to shape expectations almost imperceptibly, as delays were absorbed into planning rather than resisted, appointments scheduled with margins, deliveries anticipated within ranges rather than exact moments, and this flexibility softened daily experience, allowing minor uncertainty to coexist comfortably with routine. In postal centers, mail moved through hands accustomed to its weight and variation, envelopes sorted by sight and touch, stamps cancelled with practiced motions, and this choreography unfolded daily without commentary, sustaining a vast yet quiet network of physical exchange that depended not on speed but on reliability, and recipients learned to recognize patterns in arrival, sensing when to expect certain correspondences without checking. Homes evolved gradually as well, furniture rearranged over years rather than replaced, walls repainted after long intervals, and these small shifts reflected changing needs without erasing familiarity, allowing spaces to remain recognizable even as they adapted, and occupants developed an intimate understanding of their environments through lived experience. In educational settings, examinations emphasized synthesis over recall, encouraging students to integrate information gathered through extended study, and preparation involved revisiting notes accumulated across months, reinforcing the value of sustained attention and continuity of effort. Scientific equipment, once installed, remained in use for long periods, calibrated carefully and understood deeply by those who operated it. And this familiarity reduced error while fostering respect for limitations, grounding inquiry in practical awareness. Cultural criticism unfolded slowly through essays published in journals and periodicals, responses appearing in subsequent issues, and this delayed dialogue encouraged careful articulation, allowing arguments to mature and settle before being challenged. sustaining a reflective public discourse. Urban nights retained pockets of quiet, streets dimly lit, movement subdued, and residents accustomed to this calm adjusted their activities accordingly, aligning rest with darkness, and this natural rhythm supported restorative sleep without intervention. In agricultural communities, records of planting and harvest were maintained meticulously, notebooks passed down and added to, creating a long view of land behavior, and decisions emerged from these accumulated observations rather than immediate conditions alone. The pace of fashion reflected similar continuity, styles evolving incrementally, garments worn and repaired over years, and personal expression rooted in familiarity rather than constant novelty, allowing identity to feel stable yet flexible. Public institutions measured success through endurance, programs evaluated over extended periods, and reforms introduced cautiously, acknowledging complexity and unintended effects, and this restraint preserved trust, even when outcomes unfolded slowly. In conversations, pauses remained unfilled, silence accepted as part of exchange, giving thought space to settle, and this tolerance shaped communication into a more measured form, reducing urgency and allowing meaning to emerge through reflection. As people moved through midlife and beyond, their sense of time adjusted naturally, informed by accumulated routines and memories, and planning extended forward without fixation, grounded in an understanding that continuity itself provided stability. Libraries continued to expand not only in volume but in role, hosting quiet lectures, study groups, and shared reading hours, reinforcing their position as communal anchors where presence mattered more than throughput. The economy maintained its tangible character, transactions completed with physical records, receipts filed, accounts reconciled periodically, and this cadence reinforced awareness of resources and limits, aligning consumption with comprehension. Across regions, traditions persisted through practice rather than preservation. Dances repeated, recipes cooked, songs sung, and these acts sustained culture as lived experience rather than artifact, adapting subtly with each iteration. As the years continued their steady passage, the absence of global digital networks remained simply part of the fabric of existence, unnoticed because nothing in daily life called attention to it, and the world continued to move forward at its chosen pace, each moment easing into the next, maintaining its calm continuity, breathing evenly as time extended itself onward without boundary. And as that even extension of time carried onward, the manner in which people oriented themselves within their days remained grounded in physical cues rather than abstract signals, with morning marked by light touching familiar surfaces, afternoon defined by the slow shift of shadows across floors, and evening recognized by the softening of sound in streets and rooms, so that the passage of hours felt embodied rather than measured. In small offices, notebooks accumulated on desks, pages filled sequentially, thoughts recorded in margins, calculations revised, and these handwritten traces formed a visible map of work unfolding over weeks and months, allowing progress to be sensed through thickness and weight rather than numerical indicators. And this tangibility reinforced a sense of completion that emerged gradually. The training of professionals continued to emphasize observation and repetition, interns standing quietly beside experienced practitioners, absorbing patterns of decision-making through proximity, and learning to notice subtleties that could not be reduced to instruction. And this quiet transmission ensured that judgment matured alongside technique. In residential streets, the cadence of life remained legible through recurring sights. Children walking to school at similar times each day, neighbors tending plants on predictable mornings, deliveries arriving along known routes, and these patterns provided reassurance through familiarity, reducing the cognitive effort required to navigate daily life. The production of knowledge remained inseparable from its storage, with filing cabinets and shelves shaping what could be retained and retrieved, and this spatial limitation encouraged discernment, as choices about what to keep involved effort, fostering intentional curation rather than accumulation without boundary. In hospitals, the rhythm of care followed human cycles, rounds conducted at steady intervals, consultations unhurried, and records reviewed thoughtfully, allowing practitioners to integrate information across time, recognizing trends that emerged only through sustained observation. Public discourse continued to unfold through essays, lectures, and moderated discussions, and participation required presence, either physical or temporal, as one had to attend, read, or listen fully to engage, and this commitment filtered engagement toward those willing to invest attention. The exchange of cultural artifacts proceeded through physical circulation, books borrowed and returned, recordings shared, artworks transported carefully, and each transfer involved handling and care, embedding appreciation within responsibility. Urban infrastructure aged visibly, paint fading, stone wearing smooth, and these signs of use were accepted as part of the environment, reminding residents of continuity without prompting reflection, and maintenance addressed needs without striving for concealment. In scientific communities, long-term studies continued to define credibility. Datasets spanning decades valued for their depth, and researchers understood that significance often resided not in immediate findings but in patterns revealed slowly, reinforcing patience as a methodological virtue. Markets and fairs retained their social dimension, functioning as gathering points where exchange included conversation and observation, and economic activity remained embedded within community interaction, reducing abstraction and fostering mutual awareness. As families marked milestones quietly, birthdays, anniversaries, retirements, celebrations emphasized presence over display, gatherings small and familiar, and meaning derived from shared history rather than novelty, reinforcing bonds through continuity. The arts maintained their relationship to time, rehearsals spanning months, exhibitions planned years in advance, and audiences accustomed to waiting, understanding that preparation enriched experience, and this anticipation added depth without tension. Transportation systems continued their steady operation, maintenance schedules followed methodically, and disruptions addressed through adaptation rather than complaint, reinforcing resilience through expectation of imperfection. Across educational landscapes, curricula evolved conservatively. Foundational texts retained alongside new material, allowing students to trace intellectual lineage, understanding ideas as part of an ongoing conversation rather than isolated contributions. As the present continued to extend itself, the sense of urgency remained muted, daily life shaped by routines that absorb change gradually, and individuals found orientation not through constant update, but through stable reference points embedded in place and practice. In all these ways, the world persisted in its measured unfolding, shaped by human pacing and tangible connection, and time continued to move without emphasis, each day blending gently into the next, maintaining its quiet rhythm and carrying the present forward calmly, without reaching for conclusion as it went on. And within that calm persistence, the manner in which people encountered change remained largely experiential. Noticed first as a slight adjustment in routine rather than as an announced shift, so that a new method, a revised procedure, or an altered habit entered awareness through use, becoming familiar before it was ever named, and this gradual assimilation reduced friction, allowing continuity to absorb difference without strain. In workshops, the soundscape evolved subtly as tools wore and were replaced, each machine carrying its own timbre, and workers adjusted instinctively, recognizing performance through sound and vibration. And this sensory awareness guided maintenance long before failure, embedding attentiveness into daily practice. The keeping of personal schedules relied on memory, supported by modest notation, appointments recalled through association with place or person, and reminders scribbled briefly, so the mind remained engaged in its own organization, exercising recall regularly, and this mental activity reinforced a sense of agency over time. In courts and civic chambers, proceedings unfolded deliberately, records transcribed carefully, testimony weighed through repetition and review, and outcomes emerged through layered consideration, reinforcing confidence in process through transparency and patience rather than speed. As transportation networks matured further, routes remained stable, and minor adjustments reflected observed needs rather than predictive modeling, allowing infrastructure to evolve in dialogue with usage, and travelers learned to navigate through familiarity, internalizing geography as lived experience. The preparation of food continued to anchor daily rhythm, meals planned according to availability and season, recipes adjusted through practice, and cooking served not only sustenance but orientation, marking time through repetition and variation, and this ritual grounded households in continuity. In scientific publishing, the physical limits of journals constrained volume, encouraging selectivity, and this scarcity elevated deliberation, as authors refined arguments before submission, aware that space was finite and attention earned, fostering clarity and restraint. Public spaces accommodated rest as readily as movement, benches placed intentionally, parks designed for lingering, and this invitation to pause reinforced a cultural acceptance of stillness, allowing observation to coexist with activity without judgment. Education in the arts emphasized process over outcome, students guided to attend to progression rather than completion, and evaluation occurred through dialogue rather than metrics, reinforcing growth as a continuum rather than a threshold. As individuals aged, their relationship with objects deepened, possessions carrying accumulated meaning through shared history, and this attachment fostered care without sentimentality, recognizing use as a form of relationship sustained over time. The dissemination of practical information, schedules, instructions, notices, relied on visible placement, boards updated periodically, and this predictability allowed communities to orient themselves collectively, reducing cognitive load by stabilizing reference points. In healthcare research, longitudinal studies remained central, practitioners valuing slow accumulation of evidence, and this patience ensured that interventions aligned with observed reality, balancing innovation with caution. Libraries continued to refine cataloging systems incrementally, librarians adjusting classifications to reflect evolving understanding while preserving continuity, allowing readers to navigate collections intuitively through repeated use. The rhythm of conversation remained measured, voices unhurried, interruptions rare, and this attentiveness fostered mutual respect, allowing meaning to unfold without competition, and silence to serve as a shared space rather than a void. Across regions, craftsmanship and local industry sustained identity, products recognizable by origin, methods adapted to environment, and this rootedness preserved diversity without isolation, enabling exchange without homogenization. As the years continued their quiet passage, individuals marked time through accumulated experience rather than external signal, noticing change through familiarity deepening rather than novelty appearing. And this perspective softened the boundary between past and present. In all of this, the world remained coherent, not static but steadily evolving, shaped by hands, voices, and memory, and the present continued to extend itself gently, each moment resting within the next, maintaining its unbroken flow, calm and persistent, as time moved on without emphasis, without closure, continuing as it always had. And as that unbroken flow persisted, the manner in which communities oriented themselves around shared reference points continued to rely on physical presence and repeated encounter, with town squares, markets, and meeting halls serving as quiet anchors of collective life, their familiarity allowing individuals to feel situated without conscious effort. And these spaces accumulated meaning not through events but through use, becoming legible through habit. In offices and workshops, calendars advanced one page at a time, days crossed out deliberately, weeks recognized by rhythm rather than announcement, and long-term projects progressed through visible stages, drafts stacked neatly, components assembled gradually, so that progress could be sensed spatially as well as temporally, reinforcing patience through tangible evidence of movement. The preservation of knowledge depended increasingly on careful stewardship, archivists and librarians coordinating acquisition and conservation with a long view, understanding that loss occurred not through sudden absence but through neglect, and their work unfolded quietly, guided by routine inspections, gentle repairs, and methodical organization that resisted urgency. In transportation planning, the emphasis remained on integration rather than expansion, new routes introduced only after extended observation, and adjustments tested cautiously, allowing users to adapt without disruption, reinforcing trust through consistency rather than promise. Within families, the sharing of responsibility shifted gradually across generations, younger members taking on tasks alongside elders before assuming them fully, and this overlap ensured continuity of practice, reducing abrupt transition, and reinforcing a sense of shared stewardship over daily life. In scientific laboratories, notebooks remained central, experiments documented in sequence, observations recorded in longhand, and this narrative form of record-keeping preserved context alongside data, allowing future readers to reconstruct reasoning as well as results, and this continuity supported cumulative understanding. Public celebrations retained their cyclical nature, recurring at familiar intervals, decorations reused, rituals repeated with slight variation, and participants found comfort in predictability, allowing attention to rest on nuance rather than novelty, reinforcing communal rhythm through recurrence. The maintenance of infrastructure continued to rely on regular inspection rather than constant monitoring. Workers walking routes, listening for changes, feeling surfaces, and this embodied awareness detected issues early, embedding care within routine rather than response. In education, mentorship extended beyond formal instruction, teachers observing students over time, adjusting guidance subtly, and learning emerged through sustained interaction rather than episodic assessment, fostering confidence through familiarity. Personal correspondence continued to reflect the pace of thought, letters composed over several sittings, sentences revised, pages set aside and returned to, and this process allowed expression to mature, resulting in communication that carried the texture of reflection rather than immediacy. The practice of leisure remained integrated into daily life, walks taken without destination, reading pursued without schedule, and rest recognized as a necessary counterpart to effort, accepted without justification, reinforcing balance through acceptance rather than planning. As urban environments aged, layers of use accumulated visibly, paint-worn, stone-smoothed, paths defined by repeated passage, and residents navigated these traces intuitively, reading the city as a record of collective movement rather than a designed abstraction. In governance, records accumulated steadily, decisions documented carefully, and policy evolved through amendment rather than replacement, preserving institutional memory and allowing learning to occur through continuity rather than rupture. Cultural transmission persisted through repetition, songs learned by ear, stories retold, practices demonstrated, and this mode of inheritance preserved variation within continuity, allowing culture to remain alive without formalization. Across professional fields, reputations formed through consistent conduct observed over time, trust built incrementally, and collaboration favored familiarity, reinforcing stability within networks bounded by presence rather than reach. As seasons continued their quiet rotation, the environment remained a primary reference, weather noted through experience, patterns recognized through memory, and adaptation occurred through observation rather than prediction, aligning human activity with natural rhythm. Through all of this, the absence of instantaneous global linkage continued to shape perception subtly, encouraging depth over breadth, presence over awareness, and the present remained spacious, allowing attention to settle where it landed without fragmentation. Time continued to move forward, not as a sequence of marked transitions, but as a continuous medium inhabited steadily, each day resting within the next, routines carrying memory forward, and life proceeding calmly, without culmination, without resolution, maintaining its gentle persistence as the ongoing now extended itself onward, breathing evenly and continuing without end. And within that continuing now, the sense of orientation remained anchored to the body and its surroundings, as people gauged distance by walking time, gauged effort by breath and posture, and gauged completion by the feeling of release that followed a task brought to rest, so that judgment arose from experience rather than abstraction, and decisions aligned naturally with capacity. In printing houses, presses operated with a steady cadence, sheets stacked carefully to dry, and the smell of ink lingered as a quiet signal of work in progress, and printers adjusted pressure and alignment through touch and sight, refining output gradually, so that each edition carried the marks of attention rather than uniformity. Public notice boards continued to gather layers of information, announcements overlapping as relevance faded and emerged, and citizens learned to read these surfaces selectively, recognizing patterns of placement and timing, so awareness developed through familiarity with rhythm rather than constant scanning. In domestic spaces, routines evolved gently as circumstances shifted, meals adjusted, sleeping arrangements adapted, furniture repurposed, and these changes unfolded without ceremony, preserving a sense of home through continuity of use rather than fixed arrangement. Scientific instruction emphasized replication and patience, students repeating experiments not to confirm novelty but to internalize method, and this repetition cultivated confidence grounded in understanding, allowing future innovation to rest on stable foundation. The handling of finances remained deliberate, accounts reviewed periodically, expenses recorded by hand, and this engagement fostered awareness of limits and priorities, aligning planning with reality through direct interaction rather than abstraction. In the arts, criticism remained descriptive rather than declarative, reviewers attending performances in full, allowing impressions to settle before writing, and their observations focused on process and context, contributing to a shared understanding that valued nuance over verdict. Transportation hubs continued to serve as transitional spaces where waiting was expected, and travelers carried books, notebooks, or simply watched movement. And this acceptance of pause softened experience, allowing journeys to include intervals of stillness. Medical education continued to value bedside observation, trainees learning through presence, listening to subtle cues, and this attentiveness reinforced a holistic approach that integrated knowledge with perception, supporting care grounded in continuity. Civic engagement unfolded through sustained participation, meetings attended regularly, issues revisited over time, and consensus emerged through familiarity rather than persuasion, reinforcing trust through repeated interaction. As urban and rural environments continued to coexist without sharp division, exchange occurred through travel and trade that respected distance, and this respect preserved regional character while allowing mutual influence, maintaining diversity within coherence. The accumulation of personal possessions remained modest, choices guided by utility and familiarity, and objects earned their place through use, reducing clutter without conscious minimalism, and this restraint supported clarity of space and mind. Educational pathways unfolded without constant recalibration, students advancing through stages marked by readiness rather than schedule, and this flexibility accommodated individual pace while preserving shared framework, reinforcing confidence through alignment rather than comparison. The management of natural resources relied on observation and tradition, practices adjusted incrementally as patterns shifted, and this responsiveness maintained balance without reliance on distant coordination, embedding stewardship within local knowledge. As people moved through their days, attention remained largely undivided, tasks completed sequentially, and this focus reduced cognitive strain, allowing satisfaction to arise from completion rather than accumulation of partial effort. Cultural memory persisted through everyday reference, sayings repeated, gestures shared, and meaning transmitted through habit rather than explanation, ensuring continuity without rigidity. Across institutions and households alike, the sense of time remained expansive, days full without being crowded, years distinct without urgency, and life unfolded as a continuous practice rather than a series of milestones. And so the world continued to exist within this measured unfolding, shaped by tangible processes and human pacing, the present extending itself calmly forward, each moment easing into the next, without declaration or closure, maintaining its quiet rhythm as time itself continued to breathe, evenly and without end. And as that even breathing of time carried on without interruption, the ways in which people learned to notice change became increasingly subtle, attentive to shifts in tone rather than form, to the slight adjustment of routine that hinted at adaptation already underway, so that transformation rarely announced itself, instead settling quietly into daily practice until it felt as though it had always been there. In kitchens, the arrangement of tools reflected long familiarity. Knives kept within reach, utensils returned to the same places by habit rather than intention, and cooking proceeded through memory of touch and timing, heat adjusted by sound and scent, so that meals emerged as the result of accumulated experience rather than instruction, and nourishment aligned with rhythm rather than schedule. In archives, the slow work of preservation continued, pages turned carefully, bindings inspected, humidity monitored by observation rather than alert, and this vigilance unfolded as routine rather than urgency, ensuring continuity through steadiness, and the past remained accessible without asserting itself. Public transportation retained its role as shared interval, commuters recognizing one another through repeated presence without formal acquaintance, and these silent recognitions formed a quiet social fabric, a sense of belonging grounded in coexistence rather than interaction. In educational halls, the sound of chalk against board persisted, diagrams redrawn until proportions felt right, and students followed the movement of the hand as much as the content itself, learning not only information but pacing, and this embodied transmission, reinforced understanding through rhythm. The production of tools continued to emphasize fit and balance, handles shaped to human grip, mechanisms designed for tactile feedback, and users developed relationships with instruments through use, detecting wear early, responding with maintenance rather than replacement, and this reciprocity between person and object sustained longevity. In medical practice, follow-up remained integral, patients returning over years, practitioners observing gradual change, and treatment plans adjusted incrementally, allowing health to be understood as a continuum rather than a series of events, reinforcing care through continuity. Cultural institutions scheduled programs seasonally, allowing anticipation to build gently, audiences aligning their calendars around expected offerings, and this predictability fostered a shared temporal framework, binding individuals through common rhythm rather than simultaneous awareness. In offices, correspondence files grew steadily, letters and memoranda organized chronologically, and this order allowed decisions to be traced through time, reinforcing accountability through visibility rather than immediacy, and learning occurred through review rather than reaction. The design of public spaces continued to favor proportion and durability, materials chosen for how they aged rather than how they appeared new, and citizens developed an intuitive sense of stewardship, treating shared environments with care born of familiarity. As people moved through adulthood, their sense of direction relied increasingly on internal reference, priorities clarified through repetition, and ambition aligned with endurance rather than acceleration, allowing satisfaction to emerge through consistency. In research communities, collaboration unfolded through extended exchange, drafts mailed, comments returned weeks later, and this delay allowed ideas to settle between iterations, producing work shaped by reflection rather than momentum. Seasonal changes remained primary markers of passage, light lengthening and shortening, temperature shifting gradually, and daily routines adapted accordingly, reinforcing connection to environment through lived experience rather than abstraction. In rural workshops, tools passed between hands across generations, modifications added gradually, and each alteration reflected accumulated insight, preserving lineage through function rather than formality. The practice of reading remained immersive, books opened with intention, progress measured by bookmarks and memory, and this engagement allowed narratives to unfold fully without fragmentation, supporting deep attention through continuity. Across communities, the resolution of disagreements relied on conversation sustained over time, issues revisited as understanding evolved, and this patience reduced polarization, allowing shared history to moderate difference. As the calendar advanced quietly, the sense of inhabiting history remained diffuse, the present feeling less like a moment in transition and more like a steady state, continually adjusting without rupture, and life proceeded without urgency toward any horizon. In all these patterns, the absence of instant global connection continued to shape perception subtly, encouraging presence, patience, and depth, and the world remained coherent through its own pacing, each day flowing gently into the next, sustaining its calm continuity, allowing time to extend itself onward, breathing evenly, without boundary, without conclusion, and continuing as it always had. And within that continuing extension, the ways in which people related to knowledge retained a distinctly physical quality, as learning often involved moving through space, consulting shelves, unfolding maps, or laying documents side by side on large tables. And this spatial engagement allowed understanding to take shape through arrangement and comparison, ideas positioned relative to one another rather than stacked in sequence, so comprehension emerged as a landscape gradually explored. In town halls, clerks prepared agendas days in advance, papers distributed beforehand, and attendees arrived already familiar with material, allowing meetings to proceed with measured discussion, points revisited patiently, and conclusions refined over successive gatherings, reinforcing governance as an ongoing conversation rather than a series of decisive moments. The maintenance of personal relationships continued to rely on shared time rather than constant contact, visits planned deliberately, letters exchanged intermittently, and silence between communications accepted as neutral rather than meaningful. So bonds rested on accumulated history rather than frequency of interaction. In the sciences, the calibration of instruments remained a ritualized practice, undertaken regularly. Hands adjusting dials, eyes aligning markers, and this attentiveness fostered respect for precision grounded in care, reminding practitioners that accuracy emerged through sustained attention rather than automation. Urban commerce continued to favor storefronts with recognizable faces, owners present daily, customers greeted by name or nod. And this familiarity reduced transaction to exchange rather than negotiation, embedding economic life within social continuity. In educational institutions, libraries served as primary gathering points for study, students spending long hours in shared quiet, the presence of others reinforcing focus without distraction, and learning unfolded collectively through parallel effort rather than coordinated interaction. The circulation of cultural works depended on translation and adaptation, texts arriving slowly across borders, interpreted through local context, and this gradual diffusion allowed diversity of expression to persist, as ideas evolved differently in each setting without pressure to converge. In healthcare administration, records accumulated steadily, files thickening over years, and this visible accumulation supported holistic understanding. Practitioners recognizing long-term patterns that might remain invisible in fragmented records, reinforcing continuity of care. Public rituals surrounding timekeeping, bells marking hours, calendars posted publicly, provided communal orientation without intrusion, allowing individuals to align their activities naturally with shared markers rather than personal alerts. As people aged, their sense of belonging often deepened locally, familiarity with streets, institutions, and routines providing stability, and movement through these spaces required little conscious effort, freeing attention for reflection or observation. The practice of journalism continued to emphasize verification and context, reporters cultivating sources through long relationships, stories developed over time, and publication followed completion rather than urgency, maintaining trust through consistency. In manufacturing, planning cycles extended over years, investments considered carefully, and production scaled gradually, aligning capacity with sustained demand rather than speculation, reducing volatility through restraint. Educational assessment evolved through portfolio review and long-term observation, teachers evaluating growth through accumulated work rather than isolated performance, and this approach reinforced learning as a process rather than an outcome. Public transportation remained integrated with daily life, schedules memorized, routes internalized, and minor disruptions absorbed without anxiety, reinforcing resilience through expectation of variation. As communities faced environmental change, responses unfolded incrementally, practices adjusted based on observation and memory, and this adaptive approach allowed continuity to coexist with responsiveness, maintaining balance without abrupt intervention. Throughout households, the sounds of daily life persisted, clocks ticking softly, pages turning, dishes settling, and these auditory textures formed a backdrop that signaled normalcy, grounding experience in familiarity. In professional life, advancement occurred through demonstrated reliability over time, reputations built slowly, and mentorship guided progression, reinforcing trust through continuity rather than visibility. Across all these domains, the experience of time remained uncompressed, days containing depth rather than density, and attention rested where it was placed, allowing engagement to remain whole. And so the world continued its steady unfolding, shaped by tangible processes, human pacing and accumulated memory, the present extending itself calmly forward, each moment easing into the next without emphasis or closure, maintaining its gentle rhythm as time itself continued to breathe, evenly and without end. And as that rhythm persisted, it became less something people noticed and more something they inhabited, like air moving through an open room, present without demand, shaping thought indirectly as individuals found themselves lingering slightly longer over tasks, allowing impressions to settle before moving on. And this subtle extension altered perception in ways rarely articulated. In workshops, artisans arranged tools in familiar patterns, muscle memory guiding hands without conscious instruction, and this quiet fluency created space for attention to drift gently across the work, noticing grain, resistance, balance, each sensation reinforcing connection between effort and outcome. Civic architecture reflected similar values, buildings designed for endurance rather than spectacle, entrances clearly marked, interiors legible at a glance, and these spaces supported orientation without explanation, encouraging ease rather than urgency as people moved through them. Meals unfolded as daily anchors, preparation occupying unhurried intervals, ingredients selected by touch and smell, and eating occurred with pauses between bites, conversation flowing in fragments that required no resolution, reinforcing nourishment as both physical and temporal. In correspondence, the act of writing itself carried weight, pen meeting paper, slight resistance shaping letters, and thoughts slowed to match the pace of inscription, resulting in communication that reflected deliberation rather than immediacy. Seasonal transitions guided planning more than abstract forecasts. The length of daylight observed directly, temperatures felt rather than calculated, and communities adjusted activities accordingly, relying on collective memory to interpret change. In courts and administrative bodies, precedents mattered. Earlier decisions consulted carefully. Continuity valued over innovation for its own sake, and this respect for accumulated judgment provided stability that extended beyond individual tenure. Children learned through imitation and repetition, observing adults at close range, practicing tasks until familiarity replaced effort, and progress occurred quietly, without benchmarks announced. Growth recognized retrospectively rather than measured in real time. Markets opened and closed at predictable hours, their routines marking days, and the knowledge of these rhythms allowed planning without reference, embedding schedules within habit rather than reminders. Travel retained its sense of passage, journeys measured by stages, rest points anticipated, and arrival felt distinct from departure, allowing the mind to adjust gradually between contexts rather than switching abruptly. In storytelling traditions, narratives expanded laterally, details accumulating gently, emphasis placed on atmosphere and continuity rather than climax, and listeners settled into these stories as environments rather than sequences. Weather was discussed with nuance, variations noted from year to year, and such observations formed informal archives shared through conversation, grounding experience in lived reference rather than data alone. The management of resources reflected similar care, reserves maintained deliberately, consumption moderated by awareness of replenishment cycles, and this balance reduced extremes through foresight rather than control. In moments of solitude, individuals often engaged in unstructured reflection, thoughts drifting without objective, and this mental spaciousness allowed connections to form organically, insights emerging without pursuit. Across neighborhoods, the passing of time was marked subtly, trees growing imperceptibly, paint fading, paths wearing smooth, and these signs offered reassurance of continuity rather than loss. Ceremonies acknowledged transition without urgency, rites unfolding at measured pace, words spoken slowly, gestures repeated, allowing participants to absorb meaning through presence rather than explanation. Work days ended without abrupt separation. Tasks concluded where they stood, unfinished work resting until return, reinforcing trust that continuation did not require constant vigilance. In all of this, the absence of pressure created its own form of momentum, a steady carrying forward that required no force, and life moved on in this manner, gently extending itself, detail by detail, breath by breath, without arriving, without resolving, simply continuing, as the quiet progression of time carried everything onward in its calm, unbroken flow. And within that flow, the notion of progress remained diffuse, less an arrow and more a widening field, where improvements appeared as refinements rather than replacements, and where familiarity deepened instead of being discarded, allowing practices to mature quietly over generations. In small offices, clerks maintained ledgers with careful handwriting, entries aligned by habit, margins filled with notes that accumulated meaning over time. And these books became trusted companions, consulted not only for information but for reassurance that continuity still held. Printing presses continued their steady labor, pages drying in open air, the scent of ink lingering faintly, and newspapers arrived folded and tangible, their contents reflecting the cadence of their production, yesterday's events already softened by the time they were read. Academic inquiry moved at a deliberate pace, scholars exchanging drafts through postal systems, waiting weeks or months for responses, and this delay fostered patience, encouraging arguments to be fully formed before release, with fewer revisions driven by haste. Cities expanded outward rather than upward, neighborhoods retaining distinct textures, shops reflecting local needs, and signage remaining modest, legible from walking distance, integrating commerce into daily movement rather than demanding attention. Even in manufacturing, automation developed cautiously, machines designed to assist rather than replace, and workers remained central, their judgment guiding output, their presence ensuring accountability through familiarity. Libraries grew dense and layered, shelves bearing the marks of use, pages annotated lightly in pencil, and silence there was not emptiness but a shared agreement, allowing minds to wander without interruption. Health practices emphasized observation, physicians spending extended time listening, noting patterns across seasons, and treatment unfolded incrementally, adjustments made gently, trusting the body's capacity to respond given time. In homes, evenings settled into routines that required little planning, lamps lit as daylight receded, activities chosen by inclination rather than suggestion, and rest arrived without negotiation, shaped by fatigue rather than clocks alone. Music was encountered live or through physical recordings, repetition fostering intimacy, melodies becoming companions through familiarity, and listening often occurred alongside other tasks, blending into the background of daily life. Commerce across regions relied on relationships maintained through visits and correspondence, trust built slowly, contracts reflecting mutual understanding, and the absence of instant verification reinforced accountability rooted in reputation. Education emphasized breadth over speed, curricula unfolding across years, revisiting concepts from different angles, allowing understanding to deepen through repetition rather than acceleration. Public spaces invited lingering, benches placed thoughtfully, gardens maintained for presence rather than display, and these areas supported unstructured time, where people sat without agenda, observing light and movement. Even technology, where it advanced, did so inwardly, improvements refining reliability and longevity, devices built to last decades, repairs expected, manuals consulted, fostering familiarity rather than obsolescence. As decades continued to overlap, memory played a central role, stories told and retold, details shifting subtly, not as errors but as adaptations, aligning past with present through gentle reinterpretation. The world, shaped by these patterns, remained textured and layered, complexity arising from accumulation rather than compression, and life continued within this framework, moving neither toward culmination nor away from origin, but extending itself quietly, moment by moment, through the steady, unhurried passage of time. And within that steady extension of days, the senses remained calibrated to gradual change, eyes adjusting to familiar streets as facades weathered slowly, ears recognizing the particular hush that settled after shops closed, and these small recognitions formed an unspoken map by which people oriented themselves without effort. In rural areas, routines aligned closely with land, fields attended in measured cycles, tools repaired rather than replaced, and knowledge passed through demonstration more than instruction, each movement carrying memory of countless prior repetitions. Calendars hung on walls marked time plainly, pages turned by hand, dates noted in pencil, and the physical act of marking a day reinforced its passage, making time something that accumulated visibly rather than flowing unseen. In laboratories, researchers worked with instruments calibrated manually, readings recorded carefully, anomalies considered thoughtfully, and conclusions drawn cautiously, with replication valued over novelty and patience regarded as a methodological virtue. Mailrooms in large institutions functioned as quiet hubs, envelopes sorted methodically, routes memorized, and the arrival of correspondence introduced gentle variation into otherwise predictable days, anticipation unfolding without urgency. The concept of news remained localized, relevance defined by proximity, and events were discussed within context, their implications considered over time rather than reacted to immediately, allowing understanding to settle gradually. Craft traditions persisted alongside industry, their techniques refined subtly, apprentices learning through prolonged observation, mistakes absorbed into learning rather than corrected instantly, and mastery recognized quietly by peers. Financial transactions involved tangible exchange, signatures applied deliberately, records stored physically, and this materiality slowed decisions, encouraging reflection before commitment, with consequences unfolding transparently. In classrooms, chalk dust settled slowly after lessons, blackboards erased by hand, and pauses between topics allowed ideas to linger, students absorbing material at varied paces without pressure to synchronize perfectly. Festivals marked intervals in the year, preparations beginning early, decorations crafted by hand, and participation emphasizing continuity with past gatherings, each iteration resembling the last with slight variation. Transportation systems prioritized reliability over speed, timetables generous, delays absorbed calmly, and travel time accepted as part of experience rather than an inconvenience to be minimized. The night sky remained familiar, patterns recognized without reference, stars serving as quiet constants, their slow movement reinforcing a sense of scale beyond immediate concerns. In domestic spaces, objects accumulated stories, furniture repaired multiple times, surfaces bearing marks of use, and these traces contributed to a sense of belonging grounded in duration. Legal processes unfolded with deliberation, hearings spaced apart, testimony considered carefully, and judgments framed with reference to precedent, emphasizing consistency over efficiency. As generations overlapped, the transfer of knowledge occurred through presence, elders recounting experiences during shared tasks, younger listeners absorbing context implicitly, memory transmitted through rhythm rather than record alone. Through all of this, the absence of instantaneous connection preserved intervals of silence, gaps between actions where nothing demanded response. And within those gaps, thought settled, emotions softened, and life continued in its quiet, unforced manner, extending onward without emphasis, without closure, simply remaining in motion as time carried it forward gently, endlessly. And as those intervals of silence remained woven into daily experience, they became less noticeable, more like the steady space between breaths, present without calling attention, allowing awareness to drift inward and outward without friction. And this gentle oscillation shaped how people related to both memory and anticipation. Shops opened their doors each morning with familiar gestures, keys turning, shutters lifting, light entering gradually, and these repeated motions grounded the beginning of each day in continuity rather than novelty, reinforcing a sense that time resumed rather than restarted. In kitchens, recipes were rarely written down in full, proportions adjusted by feel, heat judged by sound and scent, and meals emerged from accumulated practice, each preparation echoing many before it, never identical yet always recognizable. The exchange of ideas occurred most often in person, across tables or during walks, pauses allowing thought to catch up with speech, and disagreement unfolded calmly, shaped by mutual presence rather than abstraction. In factories, the rhythm of machinery established a background tempo, not hurried but steady, and workers synchronized movements intuitively, conversations fitting between cycles, labor integrating with social exchange rather than isolating it. Museums and archives expanded slowly, acquisitions catalogued meticulously, provenance traced through correspondence and documentation, and visitors moved through collections at their own pace, guided by curiosity rather than prescribed routes. Weathered notice boards served as communal memory, announcements layered over time, older papers curling at the edges, newer ones pinned carefully, and together they formed a visual record of shared life unfolding gradually. In medical clinics, follow-up visits were spaced generously, progress assessed through observation and conversation, and improvement was understood as a process that unfolded unevenly, requiring patience rather than intervention. Public transportation hubs carried a subdued atmosphere, footsteps echoing softly, schedules posted clearly, and waiting became an accepted state, time passing without the need for distraction. In artistic practice, creation often occurred in solitude, drafts accumulating quietly, revisions made with care, and completion recognized internally before being shared, the work carrying traces of its slow formation. Seasonal work shaped social calendars, harvests bringing extended gatherings, quieter months allowing rest and reflection, and these cycles provided structure that aligned human activity with environmental rhythms. Books circulated through communities, borrowed and returned, margins bearing faint notes from previous readers, and these layered interactions created a subtle dialogue across time, unspoken yet present. Economic planning emphasized resilience, reserves maintained, growth measured cautiously, and success defined by stability rather than expansion, reinforcing trust in gradual accumulation. Children's games reflected this environment, rules passed orally, variations emerging organically, play unfolding without external scoring, learning cooperation through duration rather than competition. Nightfall brought a gradual settling, lights dimmed incrementally, conversations softened, and rest arrived as a natural conclusion to activity rather than a forced interruption. Across decades, these patterns reinforced one another, creating a world textured by repetition and variation, where change occurred gently, absorbed into routine without displacing it. And within this ongoing continuity, life extended quietly, moment following moment, without emphasis, without culmination, each day flowing into the next as time itself moved forward with a calm persistence, carrying everything along in its unbroken, enduring presence. And within that enduring presence, even memory itself behaved differently, not as a storehouse to be accessed at will, but as a slow sedimentation, layers forming gradually as experiences settled into the mind, certain details remaining vivid through repetition, while others faded softly without loss being remarked upon. In town, Hall's records accumulated in cabinets and drawers, papers sorted by hand, strings and labels marking categories that evolved slowly, and clerks developed an intuitive sense of where information resided, guided by familiarity rather than indexing alone. Street names carried histories that were rarely explained, their origins absorbed through use, and residents navigated by habit, turning corners almost unconsciously, bodies remembering routes long before minds articulated them. Workshops smelled faintly of materials handled daily: wood, metal, oil, paper, and these scents formed a quiet continuity that anchored people to place, signaling stability without announcement. In universities, lectures unfolded at measured pace, notes taken sparingly, pauses allowing reflection, and learning emphasized absorption over coverage. Ideas revisited across semesters until they became part of an internal landscape. Postal routes connected regions like slow-moving veins, carrying not only letters but the sense of connection itself, and the time letters spent in transit became part of their meaning, anticipation folding into communication naturally. Financial institutions maintained physical vaults and ledgers, audits conducted through careful comparison, discrepancies traced patiently, and trust reinforced through visible processes rather than instant verification. In homes, radios provided scheduled sound, broadcasts anticipated, tuning dials adjusted carefully, and silence returned when programs ended, leaving space rather than filling it continuously. Public debates occurred in designated forums, speeches prepared deliberately, responses measured, and consensus emerged slowly, shaped by repeated encounters rather than immediate reaction. Seasonal clothing rotated predictably, garments mended between uses, and wardrobes reflected continuity, each piece carrying memory of prior years, worn in without replacement urgency. Transportation infrastructure expanded cautiously, routes debated, construction deliberate, and once completed, these pathways remained largely unchanged for decades, becoming embedded in daily life. In scientific communities, replication was respected deeply, experiments repeated across locations over long intervals, confidence built through convergence rather than speed, and knowledge advanced incrementally. Leisure time was often unstructured, walks taken without destination, sitting without purpose, and these intervals allowed attention to rest on small details, light shifting, sounds receding, thoughts drifting without aim. Libraries closed at consistent hours, doors locked quietly, and the return of books followed established rhythms, fines modest, expectations gentle, reinforcing shared responsibility rather than enforcement. Family histories were preserved through stories told repeatedly, details adjusting subtly with each telling, and these narratives provided continuity, linking individuals to a longer arc without fixation on precision. As years continued to layer upon one another, these patterns remained intact, adapting subtly without rupture, and life proceeded in this manner, calmly extending itself forward without striving toward completion, without pause, simply unfolding within the steady, unremarked flow of time that carried everything along, quietly and without end. And as that unremarked flow persisted, it shaped even the way absence was understood, gaps in information accepted as natural rather than urgent, unanswered questions resting comfortably alongside what was known, and this tolerance allowed curiosity to coexist with patience, neither pressing against the other. In coastal towns, tides governed schedules subtly, boats leaving and returning according to long familiar patterns, harbors quiet at predictable hours, and the sea's slow breathing became a background presence that oriented daily life without commentary. Paper mills operated steadily, fibers processed, sheets pressed and dried, and the material itself carried importance, its texture influencing how words were written and read, binding thought to physical form in quiet partnership. Municipal planning unfolded over extended horizons, proposals reviewed repeatedly, revisions incorporated gradually, and the resulting developments blended into existing surroundings rather than standing apart from them. In theaters, performances were events prepared for patiently, rehearsals stretching over weeks, audiences arriving early, settling into seats, and the shared stillness before the first note or line carried as much weight as what followed. Agricultural records were kept in simple journals, rainfall noted, yields compared across years, and decisions made by drawing on long observation rather than prediction, reinforcing trust in accumulated experience. In homes, clocks ticked audibly, marking time through sound as well as movement, and this steady rhythm provided reassurance, a gentle reminder of continuity rather than a demand for action. Education outside formal institutions occurred constantly, skills transferred during shared tasks, explanations offered only when needed, and understanding developed through proximity and repetition. Even innovation followed this cadence. New ideas introduced cautiously, tested locally, refined through use, and only gradually adopted more widely, ensuring alignment with existing practices. Artisans signed their work discreetly or not at all, recognition circulating through word of mouth, reputation growing through consistency rather than display, and value attached to reliability. Public records were open to inspection during designated hours, citizens visiting offices in person, questions addressed through conversation, and transparency achieved through presence rather than access alone. Natural landscapes near settlements were used gently, paths worn by repeated passage, areas resting between uses, and this restraint preserved continuity between human activity and environment. In moments of loss, communities gathered quietly, rituals unfolding without spectacle, shared silence offering support, and grief integrated into ongoing life rather than isolated from it. As the 20th century eased into its later decades and beyond, the absence of instantaneous networks remained unremarkable, never mourned, simply part of the texture of existence, shaping expectations subtly. By the time calendars reached the years others elsewhere might have marked with emphasis, daily life continued much the same, quieter, localized, attentive to immediate surroundings, and time moved on without signaling its passage, extending forward gently, carrying routines, memories, and small variations along in its calm, continuous movement, without arriving anywhere, without closing, simply continuing as it always had. And within those same years, the texture of ordinary days continued to thicken rather than accelerate, as habits accumulated weight through repetition, and familiarity deepened into something almost structural, shaping perception without being consciously noticed. In city neighborhoods, shopkeepers recognized customers by posture and pace as much as by name, exchanges occurring with minimal words, trust expressed through routine, and small deviations noted gently rather than corrected. Public clocks were maintained carefully, hands aligned, mechanisms cleaned, and their shared reference provided coordination without urgency, allowing gatherings to coalesce naturally around agreed moments rather than precise instants. In offices, carbon copies stacked neatly, files moved between desks by hand, and progress revealed itself physically through the gradual relocation of paper from one tray to another, each movement marking time spent rather than time saved. Scientific instruments bore marks of calibration and recalibration, logs kept alongside them, and the history of each device remained visible, reminding users that measurement itself unfolded within continuity. Transportation across oceans retained its extended duration, ships following established routes, crews settling into long passages, and the time at sea created a liminal interval where daily concerns softened and perspective widened without effort. In cafes, conversations drifted without agenda, silences accepted, cups refilled slowly, and the passage of hours registered through light shifting across tables rather than through schedules alone. Cultural exchange occurred through travel, print, and personal encounter, ideas arriving gradually, adapted to local contexts, and influence spread like sediment carried by water rather than like a sudden current. In households, maintenance occupied a steady portion of life, hinges oiled, fabrics repaired, roofs inspected seasonally, and this care extended the life of objects while reinforcing attentiveness. Public celebrations remained modest, music and food shared locally, participation valued over scale, and repetition across years created a sense of continuity stronger than novelty. Archives expanded quietly, storage rooms reorganized periodically, finding aids updated by hand, and researchers learned the logic of these spaces through repeated visits, building an embodied understanding of where knowledge resided. In workplaces, mentorship unfolded informally, guidance offered through example, corrections made gently, and learning absorbed gradually, competence emerging through time spent rather than credentials acquired. The pace of correspondence shaped emotional expression as well, feelings articulated after reflection, responses arriving once emotions had settled, and misunderstandings resolved through patience rather than immediacy. Rural evenings were marked by diminishing light, sounds traveling farther as activity slowed, and the gradual settling of night provided closure to effort without finality, preparing space for rest. Across regions, economic differences remained, yet comparison unfolded slowly, awareness shaped by occasional travel and print rather than constant juxtaposition, allowing local standards to remain meaningful. As the years continued to pass without announcement, the absence of global digital linkage remained simply the way things were, not a constraint but a condition, shaping attention inward and outward in balanced measure. Life, carried by these conditions, continued to extend itself quietly, routines overlapping, variations accumulating gently, and time moved forward in its unbroken manner, neither hastened nor restrained, simply unfolding further, moment by moment, without conclusion, without interruption, remaining always in motion as it had been before and would remain as it went on.